Chapter 3. Leaving Home. Away from your own people. The influence of the wigwam is stronger than that of the day school, wrote journalist Nicholas Flood Davin in his 1879 report to the federal government. Attending a day school and returning home at night would not eliminate Aboriginal cultures and traditions. The only solution was to take Aboriginal children away from their families. The results are still being felt today. How could it be good when you were away from your own people? Recalled survivor Bill Walcombe. Nalakapamu of his residential school experiences in British Columbia in the 1920s. In spite of all the obstacles, including residential schools, elders continued to teach children about their culture and traditions before she attended Brandon and Birtle residential schools in Manitoba in the 1950s. Ivy Chask, Dakota, was close to her grandparents. They raised me in a traditional environment. Through them, I learned our culture, language, and ceremonies. Culture is difficult to teach. There's something about growing up with the language and living your culture. The way I was brought up, children are a sacred gift in the Dakota culture. So left is Carolyn Dagnolt's parents, Jack and Stella, Nanakwatwitung, Saltu, older brother Len, and niece Sherry at their log house in Fishing Lake First Nation, Saskatchewan. Carolyn is a family social worker in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Both Carolyn and her mother attended the Catholic Muskowekwan Indian Residential School in Lestock, Saskatchewan. In Canada's far north, the same was true. The elders were the role models for the children. They took stories to pass on and share knowledge, and children learned by imitating, listening, and observing, wrote Yale University professor Cornelius Osgood in his book, The Han Indians. Han children in the Yukon attended one of 4 residential schools in Dawson City area. Chutla, Carcross Indian Residential School, St. Paul's Hostel in Dawson City, and Yukon Hall Hostel and St. Agnes Hostel in Whitehorse. The Han did not forget their culture and traditions. In the early 1990s, they brought back their songs and dances. Elder Angie Joseph Rear is proud to say, "Our vision is to ensure that our young people continue to sing our songs. It has raised identity in us and our sense of belonging. It feels good to bring back our way. When we sing songs and we share them with others, it makes us feel happy and feel great pride in finding ourselves. Comply or be put in jail." Children arrived on foot by horse-drawn wagon, buggy, dog sled, truck, train, car, pickup boat, sleigh, taxi, bus, and airplane. Although they came in many ways, all survivors remember the common experience, how they arrived at residential school. In 1920, changes of the Indian Act forced all Aboriginal children from the ages of 7 to 15 years to attend residential school. Parents were ordered to comply or be put in jail. In 1955, the Inuit became Indians under the Indian Act. Inuit children were now part of the residential school system, resulting in the growth of schools in the far north. To fill school quotas, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, Indian agents, clergy, and staff pursued families, sometimes threatening them with legal action, imprisonment, or financial hardship. My parents received a letter from the Indian agent telling them if they didn't go to school, my parents could go to court. They had already suspended the family allowance, recalls Fred Francis Willier Cree. He attended the Catholic-run St. Bruno Indian Residential School in Joussard, Alberta, from the age of 7. I can't turn the page on. Oh, did it. Protest and resistance. For decades, communities, families, and Aboriginal leaders fought back with complaints and lawsuits against the schools. Their efforts were mostly ignored. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, refused to take action on their behalf. I am entirely adverse to having a formal investigation into these charges, he told Minister of Indian Affairs. Desperate parents hid their children at home or with grandparents. A few succeeded with this, but in most cases, the children were tracked down and taken. So, are you saying that they would put bounty hunters on them? Well, they had bounty hunters in Indian Affairs. Well, that's just scary. So you're not allowed to stay with your parents, and then people are coming after you to take you away from your parents and your family. That's exactly what happened. Desperate parents hid their children at home with their grandparents. Few succeeded with this. In most cases, children were tracked down and taken. Anthony Marshall, a Mi'kmaq from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, made his children hide under the bed or in the closet when the Indian agent arrived. That sounds like the freaking Gestapo, like they're taking your kids to a death camp. Well, they were. That's exactly what was happening. They were taking the kids to a death camp. Damn. That's fucking depressing. Yeah. Yeah, it was. Daughter, Audrey Marshall, recalls the agent looked around and asked where our food was. My dad grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and took him to the basement food cellar. Here is our food, Dad said. Audrey and her sister avoided residential school. They went to an Indian day school, then a public school. Years later, they both graduated from university. The loss of the family ties, plus physical and emotional punishments, hunger, cold, child labor, and inferior education are among the common experiences shared in residential schools. Canada acknowledged these common experiences when Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to survivors in June 11, 2008. So this has been going on a long time. This just didn't just happen with Trudeau. Oh no, this has been going on a very long time. My daughter asked if there were 250 children in the school and only 4 supervisors, why didn't you rebel and take over the school? I told her they had so much control over us that people couldn't stop them if they tried. At Fort Alexander, we were far from home, at least 5 miles, 8 kilometers. When I was in high school, in Winnipeg, he wrote letters to our family, but they never got mailed. And this Bertha Fontaine, Ojibwe, attended Fort Alexander Residential School in Assiniboine Indian Residential School in Manitoba in 1953 to 1965. Both Catholic schools. She is a director of the Native Addictions Council of Manitoba. And left, planned for Shinnebucari Indian Residential School in Nova Scotia in 1922. The immediate left, marching band at St. Michael's Indian Residential School, Alert Bay, British Columbia, circa 1945. Métis children in schools. Why do some of them look white? Because some of them were white passing. There's a lot of blood quantum people out there I've met who you would think are white people, but they grew up on the reserve and they come from people who went to residential school. And you'd never guess in a million years. That's weird. That goes against everything you've ever been taught. Yeah, does that kid look like she belongs at a residential school, or does she look like a white kid? She looks white. What does that kid look like? Chinese. What does that kid look like? White. So that was basically how much they split hairs. And then they give them horrible haircuts. Yep. Métis children with one non-First Nations parent and without Indian status were not under the control of the Indian Act. Yet, records show that many attended residential schools as live-in students or day students who went home at night. Métis education was a controversial subject for the Department of Indian Affairs. In 1899, it included both Métis and Treaty Indian children in its goal of assimilation. But one truth affected everything. It did not want to pay for Métis education. It fought against their presence in the schools unless parents paid for the privilege. Exceptions arose to government policy. When attendance at a residential school was low, Métis students were sometimes taken in. So they beefed the class up. Yeah, basically. But otherwise they didn't want them. Probably because they were mouthy, because they were part French. And they had that white privilege, so they were going to start telling the teachers off and maybe start a riot. Probably. That's racist. Yep. Parents at St. Paul de Métis, a farming colony in early east central Alberta, opened their own residential school in 1903. Indian Affairs refused to help them with funding. After the school was burned down in 1905, students returned as day students to the official Catholic residential school until the late 1930s. Churches in Alberta tried to convince the Department of Indian Affairs that Métis children were in fact Indians. If they lived the Indian mode of life, hunting, trapping, and speaking their Cree language, the government might pay for their schooling. Oh, joy! Yeah, just what every parent wants to hear. If not, the churches paid. In 1945, after Canada introduced the Family Allowance Program, churches routinely garnished these funds to contribute to the Métis children's upkeep in the schools, writes Judy D. Donald in Métis Memories of Residential Schools. Today, Métis receive the same public education as every Canadian child. Some Métis colonies proudly run their own schools. So the data project found in that 9.12% of Métis people in Canada who self-identified as Métis had attended Indian residential schools. The Indian Residential Schools Data Project in 1998. The survivor speaks. We were ridiculed. We were punished for things we didn't do. We were called savage. I struggled and struggled and struggled for many years just to get back my Métis identity, to bring back my pride, to get my spirit going again, and to make sure my children will never have to go through what I went through. Andrew Crewer, Métis. Andrew Crewer attended Catholic Fort Resolution Indian Residential School in Northwest Territories. Angie is an education activist and an elder at Grand Prairie Friendship Center, Alberta. A common experience. Write a postcard of St. Charles Garnier College, the school for boys in Spanish, Ontario. Girls attended St. Joseph's School. Postcards like this were printed to publicize various residential schools. Below, boys from Manitoulin Island, Ontario, disembark the Red Bug, the school's ferry, to attend residential school in Spanish. Why would they want them to speak Spanish? Well, because we were colony back then, and we also had Spanish colonizers. It's kind of hard to explain. I don't know my history as well as I should. They took us away. To get to high school, we flew a float plane from Pelican Narrows in Saskatchewan to Schist Lake in Manitoba. Next, we went by taxi to the bus depot in Flin Flon, Manitoba. We took the bus to Winnipeg, 8 hours away, with no snacks or meals. One time, 4 of us students got stuck in Flin Flon overnight with no supervisor or money. I ended up sleeping in the hospital. I don't even know why I ended up there. It took a while, but we all made it back to school. Christina Sewap, Woodland Cree, Assiniboine Indian Residential School, Winnipeg, Manitoba. My mom was a single parent of 5 children. We moved back to the reserve because although we lived with my grandparents, they were also struggling to survive in Sarnia. The house we moved into was too small for us, although it didn't feel that way. The Indian agent got wind of it and picked up us kids and took us away from our mom. I was only 5 years old. My family was one of the lucky ones. The children got to go back home after 1 year. After that year, I was scared I would become physically ill. I became that little kid standing in line, waiting to get strapped all over again. It took me a long time to recognize how much that year affected me. Ningwakwe, Priscilla George, Anishinaabe Mohawk Institute, Brantford, Ontario. He went away. Away he went into the big building to board the train. He left Vancouver at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we got to Lytton at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in August. You can imagine that it was quite hot, and there was a breeze blowing. It was like a breeze out of an oven. Finally, a horse and buggy arrived to meet us. It was about 3 miles, 5 kilometers from the Lytton station across from Thompson River, and up the hill to where residential school was. Simon Baker, Squamish, St. George's Indian Residential School, Lytton, British Columbia. My two sisters and I were picked up by a dog sled. The Northwest Mounted Police took us from Fort McKay to Fort McMurray in Alberta, then by train to Edmonton. Before we took another train to Gruard, the nuns put us in a tub filled with hot water. We thought they were going to cook us. Probably. Don't get cooked, kids. Don't get cooked by the witches. Sounds like Hansel and Gretel. Our trip to school was 867 kilometers. That's almost 1,000 miles away, buddy. You can't walk that. No, you can't run away, and you can't get home. We never went back home. We lost our language because we weren't allowed to speak it. Nina Schott, Gallup, Cree Denny, St. Bernard Mission Residential Schools, Gruard, Alberta. So this is before and after. This is Terry Alec, Interior Salish, in 1968 with his brothers and cousin and dog. The children are on their summer holiday. This is back at St. George's Indian Residential School. That's the same family? That's the same family. In Lytton, British Columbia, Terry Center and his brothers and sister cousin display their school haircuts. Holy shit, they gave them military haircuts. It was a military school. It's a British military school. You know what's so scary? People who survived this must be fucking deadly. Makes me think of Conway. Doesn't it though? They changed our appearance. They cut our hair. Terry Alec, Interior Salish, St. George's Indian Residential School, Lytton, British Columbia. They took our beautiful parkas and we never saw them again. They gave us red Mother Hubbards and loose-fitting parka to wear. They were so thin. We wore mucklucks and runners. They were so cold. Novelik, Helen, Tulukanuk, Inuit, Stringer Hall, Anglican Hostel, and Sir Alexander Mackenzie School, Inuvik, Northwest Territories. When I arrived, the nuns took everything out of my luggage. One nun told me, don't even bother crying. Francis Robinson, Okanagan, St. Mary's Indian Residential School, Cranbrook, British Columbia. They sewed the boys' pockets shut so they couldn't put their hands in their pockets. That's fucking miserable, buddy. It is, but that's the kind of stuff they would do to break people. When my brother came home from summer, he was amazed that he had pockets in his pants. Bertha Fontaine, Ojibwe, Fort Alexander Indian Residential School, Pine Falls, Manitoba. It's just such a trite thing to do, but it adds up. It's narcissistic abuse, basically. Suprex was an extermination liquid applied to the children's heads to remove lice and nits, whether they needed it or not. I took this photo of Suprex bottles in the abandoned Brandon Indian Residential School. They reminded me of my grandmother, Beatrix Sirksa Kenny, Ojibwe, who went to St. Margaret's School in Fort Frances, Ontario. On her first day, only 5 years old, on January 11, 1940, they cut off her ringlets and scrubbed what was left of her head with kerosene in case she was infested with lice, recalls granddaughter Trish Cullen Watt. That's really mean. Yes, it is really mean. Suprex bottles scattered on the floor of the infirmary of the abandoned Brandon Indian Residential School in Manitoba. Beatrix Sirksa Kenny above in a photo from St. Margaret's Indian Residential School, Fort Frances, Ontario. They took her hair? Yeah, that's what they did. They took her hair. Is that why, Hollywood took your hair? I don't know that Hollywood took my hair. I know someone has a problem with my hair. And until I can change my locks, I might as well just keep it short because I don't want to piss someone off. It's really fucking racist, dog. Yeah, well, there's some really fucking sick racist motherfuckers out there. They gave us a number. Are these children? These are children. And they're from St. George's Indian Residential School in Lytton, British Columbia. In their school uniforms, possibly visiting Anglican Mission in the background, also seen in St. Mary and St. Paul Catholic Church. The photo taken in 1941 is from the private collection of photographer Charles Nels, who worked at Earls Court Farm in a 2,834-hectare fruit farm nearby. Would you be scared if you lived near that? I'd be terrified. He gave us a number. I did not have a name. I had a number. My number was 6. The only time I was called by my name was when I got into trouble, which is quite often because I always stood up for myself and for the other girls. I have no good memories except for the memories we made among us girls. There was no such thing as respect, but we taught ourselves to have respect. Angie Crier, Métis at Fort Resolution Residential Schools, Northwest Territories. I was in a state of shock or in awe about the school when I was first brought there. I gave out a type of scream that I had never ever given out in my life. I learned that there is a name for that kind of scream. It's called a primal scream. Is that like a rock star school? Well, sometimes I wonder if that's why the music industry is so messed up. But it is also a safe place for people to explore that stuff in some ways too. So, good with the bad. That is a cry that a person gives, a cry of distress that comes from the center of the soul. Ronald E. Ignatz. Secwepemc. Let's try that again. Secwepemc, Kamloops, Indian Residential School, British Columbia. Can you read that again? I was in a state of shock or in awe about the school when I was first brought there. I gave it a type of scream that I had never ever given out in my life, and I learned there is a name for that kind of scream. It's called a primal scream. That is a cry that a person gives, a cry of distress that comes from the center of the soul. Ronald E. Ignatz from Secwepemc, Kamloops Indian Residential School, British Columbia. By the time I got to the school in the early 1950s, the Jesuits started to be a little more civilized. Strapping was still common, only now it had changed from a whip to maybe a stick. At one time, there were 4 of us brothers in the school. My older brother was always shushing me. I'd say something in Ojibwe and he'd be saying, "Be quiet, you're going to get it." Gordon Shawanda, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, St. Charles Garnier College, Spanish, Ontario. Everything was new and strange. Holy shit, is this why you don't want to get on your knees when you pray? Well, I was never in residential school, but I just feel more comfortable sitting on the ground. Why do you think people pick on you about it? Because alcoholics like to not mind their business and pick on people about how they pray when they should be worrying about themselves. So if you pray in bed, does that count? Well, these guys are praying in bed. But they're on their knees. Why aren't you on your knees? Because I don't want to be on my knees. I want to lie down. It's the intention that matters. A lot of these kids became alcoholics. Everything was new and strange, or strange and new. We were first ones to arrive. They took our own clothes and put them away. And that was the last time we saw our clothes. They gave us socks, shoes, shirts, pants, and bedding. We were told where to sleep in the big dormitory. We were not used to sleeping bags. So my brother Joe said, "Let's throw our mattresses on the floor." So we did. And then we got into bed, clothes and all. Simon Baker Squamish, the St. George's Indian Residential School in Lytton, British Columbia. Every week in the elementary school, we got 10 tokens, which were pieces of paper. Students could take a token from you if you spoke your language. At the end of the week, whoever collected the most tokens got a reward of some kind. I think it was candy, but I spoke Cree. I lost all my tokens, and I never got a reward. Christina Sewip, Woodland Cree, Guy Hill, Indian Residential School, to pass Manitoba. I'd hate to be the guy with all the tokens, eh? I'd hate to be that freaking guy, too. Imagine you got candy and no one wants to share it with you. I can imagine. Maybe some people would, but they were like just pretending to be his friend because he knew he was a rat. There was never enough to eat. We got oatmeal, toast, maybe soup at lunch. Supper was made with potatoes or whatever left over at lunchtime. Meat was mostly on holidays. On Sundays, us fellows who worked in the greenhouse stole potatoes from the root cellar. We roasted them in the furnace. We stole a small pig and took it down to the Grand River and cooked it. Everyone stole something to eat, and as long as you didn't get caught, you were all right. Ron Stiers, Cayuga Mohawk Institute, Brantford, Ontario. Well, that's setting a really good example. As long as you don't get caught, you're all right. Well, that's why the world is fucked up today, because we pound that message into people, And now the people who lead and set examples also pound that into people too. As long as you don't get caught, you're all right. And that's not necessarily true. Who are you when no one's looking is important. That's why I don't worry about what people think or don't think when I think they may be looking when I'm praying. Children prayed many times a day. In 1950, Swampy Cree boys kneeled before bedtime with an Anglican supervisor looking on at Bishop Horton Memorial School in Moose Factory Island, Ontario. There's a supervisor making sure they stay on their knees. That's right. Just like the person who took the tokens to get the candy at everyone else's expense. We picked potatoes for 4 weeks in the fall. For 6 weeks every spring, boys and girls piled wood for the school furnaces. The classroom was on the back burner. Our school library was a little cupboard that was always locked. Our best reading materials were comics brought in by externs. They were the Métis and other day students who lived nearby and went home at night. Larry Loy Cree. And next is going to be chapter 4, Life at School. We'll end there.